Just like Heroku did with the 12-factor app, AWS created the WellArchitected Framework to document the best practices they observed running workloads in the cloud. The WellArchitected Framework started as a white paper in 2015, but went to center stage during Werner Vogels' keynote at reInvent 2016. As of today, it is massive, consisting of 6 core white papers that total over 400 pages. It would be easy to dismiss it as boring, long-winded documentation, but doing so would be a big mistake. There is a lot of gold to be found if you are willing to dig. In this episode, John and Chris kick off a 3-part series. They grab their shovels and dig deep into the WellArchitected Framework. Welcome to MobyCast, a show about the techniques and technologies used by the best cloud-native software teams. Each week, your hosts John Christensen and Chris Hickman pick a software concept and dive deep to figure it out.
Welcome, Chris. It's another episode of MobyCast.
Hey, John. Good to be back.
Yeah, good to have you back. So we're missing Rich today. We'll do our best to produce this show on our own, but we have a lot to cover. We're going to go over the AWS WellArchitected Framework. This might take a couple of episodes just because it's got 5 pillars, and each one of those is so huge, holding up so much information, but it's all really good stuff. So we can't do our normal pleasantries. We have to go right into it. Chris, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, absolutely. So, last episode we were talking about software architecture under the guise of 12-factor app framework. And so obviously 12 factors that we went through. Today we're going to come at it from a different approach with AWS has their well-architected framework, right? Which is all about answering the question, are you well-architected? And so it's a different lens, right? Of looking at your architecture. And as you mentioned, core to that, there's 5 pillars, basically subject areas to go focus in on your architecture. And the 12-factor app, obviously we had 12 things to talk about. So it might seem like the 12-factor app, wow, that's more to cover there. And the truth is absolutely not the case at all. The well-architected framework is massive in its scale. It's very, very comprehensive. Each one of those pillars can go really deep with many design principles and focus areas, best practices. There is very much just a wealth of information there. Sometimes it's kind of hard to unpack, and that's what we're going to try to do with this episode.
Yeah, right, Chris, and sorry to interrupt, but I was going to say that another difference for me is just that the 12-factor app really feels technical. It just feels like this is, as a software developer, these are a bunch of things that you can think about when you're writing an application. And the well-architected framework, I feel like, and this could be wrong, but I feel like it's easier, and we'll see this, it's easier to draw the lines between the pillars and the business needs. So I do feel like this sort of steps up a level and kind of keeps the whole purpose of software in mind, and how much it costs and what other things could happen that might impact your business. When you're talking about the well-architected framework, and it's not just purely technical for technology's sake.
Right, absolutely, yeah. I mean, the 12-factor app is really good for what it's designed for, and it really is really focused on an application and the pragmatic things that go into building and deploying and operating an application, especially like on a PaaS platform like Heroku.
Sure. Yeah.
And so it's not looking at things like, hey, am I optimizing my, how does this affect cost? Like, am I being efficient with, how I'm spending money? Like, how much is it going to cost to run this and operate it? Do I have the right people to do it? Am I meeting the needs from the business? And what about compliance issues and whatnot? So the well-architected framework, just much more comprehensive. It's literally, it completely subsumes the 12-factor app and then some, right? So,
Yep.
So like I said, a lot.
So we probably better say what it is, or we could spend the entire episode just talking about like how it's different than the 12-factor app without ever actually saying what it is. Let's do it. Right. Let's say what it is.
Right. So the well-architected framework, it's basically it's documented a set of foundational questions to help determine if a specific architecture aligns with what are deemed cloud best practices, right? And so what it's doing is it's giving you it's providing a consistent approach to evaluating your architectures against those best practices. And then it's going to help advise what changes might be necessary to bring that into alignment. And so as part of this framework, it's really three main things that it's comprised of. So one is general design principles. Two are the pillars. So there's 5 pillars that kind of hold up this framework. And then the third component would be the actual review. So this is a series of questions that you go through that are related to each one of these pillars and subsections and focus areas inside those pillars. And basically just you go through and ask yourself these questions, and that kind of gives rise to, okay, what changes do I need to make? So it's those 3 components that go into it. There are supplements to this as well that we'll get into later. So the WellArchitected Framework is documented via like whitepapers, and there's also HTML web page versions of that as well. There is something that's newish, is the WellArchitected tool, and which is actually pretty useful, and really helps you do this review process and keep track of it and whatnot. So we'll get into that as well as we go through this.
I mean, that sounds great. And I guess as we get into it, I'll say from my perspective, you'll be teaching me. Like I know in general some of the principles, and I've certainly been around it enough that I've done through osmosis. I've picked up a lot of it. But it'll be interesting to kind of get a little deeper into it, especially because what I'll tell you is that my first impression of it is like, oh my God, a vomit of like information that is not that useful for somebody that already knows what they're doing. Get away from me. You know, like that. There's a little bit of that in my mind when I see this amount of just documentation thrown out there. It's like, come on, get over yourselves, right? Like a little bit of me says that. But I think what's starting to happen is that you looked into it this week more deeply in order to prepare for this. And, you know, the surprise might be like, oh, there's some real gems in here and some things that if you just follow this, you're unlikely to go wrong. Like this is sort of like, it could be like the map to being, to do your job as a software architect. Like if just follow this map to the treasure, that's all you have to do. It's just that the map is like 5,000 pages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, you know, as kind of talk about, I mean, there is a wealth of information here. There's so much to wade through, and it really is kind of difficult to unpack it in some regards, but it is a treasure trove. Like this, like they have AWS has spent a lot of time on this.
Right.
I think they first rolled out the WellArchitected Framework in 2015. This is something that they continually are updating. It's based upon like what they internally do at AWS and Amazon, right? Like how they're actually building things. So this is very, very practical, real world. I mean, none of this is like, you know, theoretical. It's not academic.
Or
right?
ivory tower. Yeah.
No, absolutely.
Do you get the sense that it's like kind of Werner Vogels like baby, if you will? Like this is kind of the office of the CTO. If there was one thing that they produced, it's kind of this.
I don't know if I would say it's Werner's baby, because I kind of see Werner more as like technology and vision. And this is much more along the lines of like your VP of engineering type thing, right? So, I mean, that said, I mean, he was the one that did unveil it and whatnot, but I would think that like his interests are aligned more with like things like DynamoDB and you know, technology in general, and you know, things like bringing blockchain to the cloud and whatnot, as opposed to like how do you actually build, deploy, operate systems, right? Like what are all the check boxes that you need to do something like that? I mean, obviously he's interested in it, right? But I don't think that would be necessarily like his passion.
Interesting.
Yeah. And if more Werner is listening, he can let us know.
Yeah. But let us know, Werner.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Right.
I think we're going to talk about general design principles.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and so really what kind of like the overall like philosophy of this is just, it's this well-architected framework is saying, look, what you did in the past for like on-prem type applications, everything has changed. Like cloud native has changed everything. Right. So there's some just core general design principles here that you need to just really embrace, right? If you are going to be cloud native. So things like, you no longer have to guess capacity needs.
I want to stop you there because I mean, who knows who our audience is? Like podcasting is the worst for figuring out who actually listens to you. If you listen to this, please let us know who you are so we can like get you the right information that you want. But like, I'm guessing that not that many people that listen to this have ever had to guess capacity needs, right? Like that's like 2000 through 2005 stuff. Like that's over 10 years ago that people were doing that. So I don't know. It's just like, that doesn't feel like a relevant point anymore. Like, unless you're talking to, old slow moving enterprises, and then it's like it's almost like a sales pitch. Like, stop guessing capacity needs.
I think we're so close to this that it may feel that way. But I think like real world, like this is still something to be thinking about, right? Like there's still a lot of people that are on-prem that are not in the cloud yet, or they're just working to go hybrid. There's a lot of code out there that's still on-prem.
Yeah.
It's hard to believe, right? But right. It really is the case.
And call up Dell and order a bunch of servers or something. Yeah.
And then even when people do move to the cloud, right? Like, and that's part of like what this general design principle is trying to get at, is that like when people do move from on-prem to the cloud, they kind of use the same models, right? So they're just thinking about, okay, I don't have a server on a rack in my on-premise data center anymore, so I spin up a server in the cloud, in EC2.
Yeah.
And I'm just now managing that, right?
Right.
And so
then you're still guessing capacity, how many EC2s am I going to need?
Absolutely, right? Because who knows? Are you really taking advantage of auto scaling? Are you wiring that in with your scale up and scale down policies, right? Like, so that's what this is all about, right? Is just saying like, stop guessing your capacity needs. Like, this is a game changer in the cloud now, right? And so you need to embrace that. So going through some more general design principles, another one would be, you can now test at scale. So before that was very difficult because you had to you just had to buy a bunch of capacity, right, in order to do that. Now it's like you can just spin up infrastructure on a moment's notice as much as you need, and then when you're done with it, tear it all down. So testing at scale is just totally something you can do now. Another general design principle is just to automate all the things to make experimentation easier, right? So you can use infrastructure as code in the form of things like CloudFormation to rapidly like spin up these environments and the infrastructure you need to go do experiments and test. And again, like the cloud has enabled this. Like this is stuff that, in the on-prem world, much more difficult to do.
I don't know, man. For those on the inside, if you're listening and you're like, you've been doing AWS for a long time and you played with CloudFormation, that one might ring a little hollow. Like, yeah, experimentation didn't actually get it any easier because now I'm spending all of my time babysitting CloudFormation templates and waiting for them to spin up and spin down. And I thought I was going to be able to do experiments. So there's a little bit of a feeling that I get from that because CloudFormation is very time consuming to tinker with. Like, yes, once you have it nailed, okay, now I can spin up an environment easily with one command. But you pay for that, right? And a lot of tinkering and waiting for environments to spin up just a little bit wrong, and then oh man, and I've got to try that again. You get it. Oh, it's still a little bit wrong. Like now you just lost half a day. In those two statements. So anyway, something to kind of push back on AWS and their all their magic is that that's not cheap.
Yeah, part of that is just where your how far along you are in maturity on adopting those kind of things, right? So it's like it's all a journey, and for some people, like they're doing it in bits and pieces, right? Or they're just starting that journey, and then there are folks out there that are really like have embraced this and been doing it for years, and for them, doing it really is like very easy for them to spin this stuff up, right? They're not doing a lot of that troubleshooting. Exactly. So, it maybe just the important point here is that just now you have the opportunity to leverage that, right? Like actually getting there is maybe hard, but it's there now, right? Some other design principles drive architectures using data. So you can now make fact-based decisions on how to improve your workload. I'm not so sure that that's necessarily specific to the cloud versus on-prem, but definitely something that we want to do in a modern app, right, is to have that feedback loop where we're collecting the telemetry, we're looking at the metrics, and that is informing us on like what needs to be changed and how do we make improvements, and then be able to measure the effects of those changes to make sure that it truly is an improvement, right?
Yeah.
With cloud, we definitely want to allow for evolutionary architectures. So, you never want to be stuck with a particular technology. And so this is, it's still the challenge, but I think, definitely in cloud, it becomes a bit easier to do, right? Because you have a great toolbox to work from. And you can, get these services and options and features as managed services that, you don't have to go and stand up a box and install software and run it and whatnot. So if you want to try a new NoSQL technology, it becomes much easier, right? If you want to, caching or whatnot, or backup, or multiple networks and peering and whatnot. I mean, all that stuff is much easier to do in the cloud as opposed to on-prem.
Right. Yeah.
And then lastly, another design principle is to improve through game days, which, again, not necessarily cloud specific, but I think the cloud makes this a lot easier to do.
Can you help me know what a game day is?
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting. I mean, game day is like it's kind of like misnamed in a way, because it's like, it almost feels like it should be called like scrimmage. And so, because what you're doing, so a game day is when you're purposely setting aside time to go and simulate things that can happen, that can go wrong, and then how you deal with them, right? So it's like, let's have a game day where we test what happens if a whole AZ goes down, and what happens there. Okay. Or let's have a game day where we're just going to go and make sure that we can let's simulate a database failure where we have to restore from a backup, right? And just do that. So it's going through and doing these, practicing these things, and practice responding to, time critical failures and other exceptional events that you want to be able to practice and make sure that you can do it, and not find out that, hey, we really didn't have this button down when it happens in real life, right? So it's practicing those things that we normally don't do, and those are game days.
Got it.
Right.
It sounds luxurious, honestly. Like, that sounds so fun and great, but it's also like a whole day of your team not doing anything, not building features or not dealing with customer issues or whatever it is. Like a whole day of just like imagining a black swan event happening and making sure you can deal with it. Like, it does, like, it's so important, but at the same time, it's also luxury. It's like a luxury for a lot of companies, I think.
So this is a good point. And this is something definitely to kind of call out, and as we go through this well-architected framework. And so this is a very comprehensive framework, and this is geared towards like the most sophisticated systems and workloads that you could run, for budgets, very big, and for systems that can handle millions of requests, billions of requests, millions of users type thing, down to the other end of the spectrum. So as we talk about this and go through that, I mean, this is where some of the complexity comes in, is trying to figure out, okay, what's really applicable to me, right? Like, so there's these 5 pillars, and each one of these pillars has its focus areas and has its best practices. And as we go through the review, there's going to be questions that ask us about this or that. You have to look at your own situation and say, you know what, like, that's not something that we're going to do, right? From a pragmatic standpoint, like we don't need to survive like a region failure. Like it's just, it's just not something that we're going to, invest the time and money on. Likewise, it may be like,
it's like, why wouldn't you need to survive that? And it's because, if 90% of the services in this region go down, and they're just not available, like our little company is going to be the least of people's worries in a lot of cases, right? Like everything else they do is also going to stop working. So not something we have to worry about.
And it's very much like a cost issue. So it becomes, to do all of this stuff becomes very expensive, both from just an actual, like what my bill from AWS looks like and versus like just the amount of time and resources that goes into building and maintaining and operating these things. Right. So, so that's the challenge for all of us as we kind of look through this lens of the well-architected framework is what's the right level of architecturedness for you.
That's a hard thing that they left as an exercise for the reader, though, don't you think? It's like, wouldn't it be nice if it wasn't just like, here's a perfect architecture and like, good luck getting as close to this as you can. Instead of like, here's a perfect architecture, like here's like kind of ways of identifying how to make these trade-offs, because these trade-offs are the hard, like there's kind of magic in these trade-offs, right? It comes from years of experience knowing, don't chase that down. It's really not going to likely happen. So let's spend our money building this new thing instead of, worrying about that potential thing. Like that ends up being the magic of being a software architect or a leader in engineering. I feel like this helps you not miss anything that you should be thinking of, but it doesn't help you make the decisions necessarily. Like it doesn't help you know if it's okay to, and maybe it does, and we just haven't got to that part yet.
Mm-hmm. No, I think it's for the most part, it's not even addressed, right? But that said, I think like this concept of like if you can imagine like a slider, right? And going from at the very far left, it's like this is like the minimal amount of work to do for like, okay, I'm not going to.
It's running.
Yeah, right. It's just it's serving some requests, maybe right. Like maybe you're now, maybe not. But versus on the far right, like this is completely buttoned up. This is you're doing game days. You can support region failures, all that kind of good stuff. And you can imagine like that slider being able to drag it to like whatever your threshold is, right? And then it would pick out the relevant parts of the well-architected framework and the relevant questions and the relevant action items, commensurate with that. So there's definitely some opportunity there to do like that. Seems really straightforward to do, and maybe they will do it.
But if they don't, guess who is going to do it? We are. We're going to do that. We're going to help you figure this out. Stick with us. We are going to help you learn the stuff you need to know to be able to make these decisions. So we'll stand in AWS's stead for a bit. But in the meantime, let's figure out what AWS wants you to do. Let's keep going.
Right. All right. So like we said, the three components: design principles, the pillars, and then the questions and answer, the review itself. Right. So we went through the design principles. So next up's the pillars. As I mentioned, there's 5 pillars, and these are big, comprehensive areas of focus. And so maybe just quickly running through the five pillars. So you have operational excellence, you have security, you have reliability, you have performance efficiency, and you have cost optimization. All right. So those are the five broad areas, and everything that goes into being a well-architected workload will fall into one or more of those pillars.
You just used the word workload. Is that, I haven't really used that in my career until I started doing AWS stuff. Is that kind of an AWS-y term, or is it really a more broad term and everybody, or a more recent term, or I don't know why it is, but I just haven't said workloads until I started doing a bunch of AWS stuff. You?
No, I think it is kind of a AWS preferred term. And, they're using it in context of like, what are the components to do some provide some business value, right?
Yeah.
So it's the
A
architecture.
workload might be storing stuff,
Mm-hmm.
or it might be computing something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's I mean, you need something, some word to describe it, right? So like we might say like web application, right, or something like that, or you know.
I guess that's why I started using it, is because I was like, oh, that's a handy term. It makes sense. It's clear what it means, and I didn't have a word for that before. Now I do.
Right.
Cool.
Yep. So moving on to the first pillar, operational excellence, right? So this one's all about the ability to run and monitor systems to deliver business value and to continuously improve supporting processes and procedures, right? So pretty straightforward here, right? This is like, okay, you have your workload and you want to run and monitor it, and you want to get better as time goes on, right? So that's about operational excellence, and this is a big one too, right? Because there's a lot that goes into it. Like, I kind of touched on this before. Like, this is actually one of those things that really separates the medium performing teams from like the really top notch performing teams. Is like it's kind of, I mean, it's pretty straightforward, right? To build an application, deploy it, stand it up, right, and start taking requests. It's another thing to do that at scale and to do it reliably, and everything else that goes into that, right? Like, it's a lot of times, I think the real work starts once you go into prod, right? Once you go to production, it's like, okay, like there's a lot of stuff here that goes on, especially if you have some requirements where you have to be, have some sort of uptime, whether it be 3 nines or 4 nines or whatever it may be. So that's what this pillar is all about.
Yeah, it's like the picture I have in my mind is when the jets get fueled in midair. Like that's when you can do that, then you're starting to approach operational excellence. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I mean that's like just one small slice of it, right?
Yeah.
So like there's also the, there's everything that goes into that, as well. Like, okay, how do we actually locate you in 3D space? And how do we, hook these 2 planes up, and it just everything else that goes along with it, and do it while you're flying 600 miles an hour.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
Yeah. So why don't we talk about some of the design principles that form this particular pillar? So one would be to you want to perform operations as code, and so this is it's a really strong theme throughout the entire WellArchitected framework, and everything that AWS does is just automate as much as possible, right? Like if it's something that can be automated, do it. Like spend the resources, spend the time to do it. Really root out all the manual steps. Anything that has to be manually performed like that, you need to see. Like, ask yourself, can I automate this? Can I have a computer do it? Right. So that's what So that's a general design principle here. Is like, if you can automate it and have code do your operations, then that's what you want to strive for. Another principle is annotate documentation. So the idea here is that there's some amount of documentation that's manually produced, but then it should be supplemented with automation, with code, right? It should be able to build that up. So whether it may be like documenting an architecture or a code base or run books and procedures and whatnot, just again thinking of documentation not as like this static thing that someone has to go update, in an editor, but instead more of a living thing that can be more easily updated.
Right, that updates itself as you update your application.
Yeah. So another design principle is to make frequent, small, reversible changes. So that goes without, but yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah, but it's so hard for companies. Oh my goodness, I think it's particularly hard for companies that are led by folks that don't have a lot of experience with technology. They just love the big bang of like, look at all these great shiny new features. I mean, And there's truth in it, right? Like Apple still releases one big iOS release a year that has big shiny new features, and they're all packaged together. And it's sort of, 100% against this principle. Like the better, more safe, more automated, more well-architected way of doing it would be if each of those features came out a little bit at a time, small changes, maybe even only to a few people at a time to limit blast radius if there's a problem. Like that's what AWS is saying to do, and it's obviously what they do inside of AWS. Like the feature rollouts with AWS are constant; they're never ceasing. Apple's getting more that way with iOS too. Every once in a while, I'm like, okay, look at that, that's new. And there was no big media event around it, but I think people that are in traditional companies running, used to doing things the old way, it's really hard for them to let go of like big bang releases. And we work really hard as a consulting company to try to break that habit, but we are not always successful. And we do end up with, high risk releases.
Yeah. And it's also, like in the example you give with Apple, they're definitely doing this with their backend services, right? It's like client code, right? Like actual, app, mobile. This is your mobile iOS, your actual operating system software, right? So that world is definitely more of the big release things, which
it has a marketing. It works in marketing, and so and when it comes to aligning software to business value, that is important. So that consumer-facing stuff probably does need to keep behaving that way to an extent.
It's a bit of a user education issue too, right? Like it'd be really probably kind of confusing if like every time you open up your phone, like brand new ways of doing something, or
right, yes,
right. It's like, how do you keep track of what it is? And so I think that probably goes into this as well. But anyway, when we're talking about workloads, this definitely frequent small reversible changes is definitely the way to go. Another core design principle here is to make sure you're refining your operations procedures frequently. So again, you're continually learning, you're continually improving. You're never done. So always be ruthlessly looking at your operations and like, how can we improve? Another principle is anticipate failure, right? So failures are going to happen. So prepare for it. So
absolutely
think about like what can go wrong, and then how are you going to address that? How are you going to remediate that? And which failures are you not going to be concerned with?
And even the smallest team can take a few minutes or an hour or two here and there to think about this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then lastly, make sure you just learn from your operational failures, right? So when things do go wrong, which they will, do the analysis, do the investigation to figure out, okay, how did this happen? What went wrong, and what changes do we need to make so that something like this doesn't happen in the future? So that learning process.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
Right. Operationally excellent. And then, so they do point out like the key AWS service here for this pillar is CloudFormation, right? So CloudFormation is the infrastructure as code product that they offer that allows you to basically codify, right, what your infrastructure looks like for running your operations, for anything and everything, right? Not just like what servers get stood up and how application code gets deployed, but also, what alerts get created, what events are being tracked and whatnot. So all that can be expressed via code. And so CloudFormation is a key part of that.
Right. And AWS is doing a better job recently. I've noticed this year, they're doing a better job of making sure that things are CloudFormation ready when they're released. There was quite a while where people were getting upset that new services kept coming out without CloudFormation support. And that seems to be less and less common now.
Yeah, I know that just at the last reInvent that they mentioned that several times, that's top of mind for them, that as they release new services, they definitely want to have CloudFormation support from the get-go.
Just a sec. There's something important you need to do. You must have noticed that MobiCast is ad-free, but Chris and John need your help to make this work for everyone. Please help the MobiCast team by giving us 5 stars on iTunes, writing positive reviews, and telling your colleagues, friends, neighbors, children, and pets about the show. Go ahead and do it now. Great. I promise not to ask you to do that again.
Great.
Yeah. So key focus areas for this particular pillar. There's 3: prepare, operate, and evolve. Right. So prepare is thinking about everything that what do we have to have in place? What do we need to do in order to be operationally excellent? Operate, like what happens when the service is actually, the workload's actually running. And then evolve is that learning process, right? Like how are we going to continually improve? So kind of everything in this pillar falls into these three focus areas.
So I just want to help our listeners kind of understand the outline of the well-architected framework. It looks like each of these pillars has several subpoints, and they're the same for each pillar, right? So each pillar has design principles, each pillar has a key service, each pillar has focus areas, each pillar has best practices, and each pillar has key points. Is that right?
Yeah. So I think, less the key points, that's not necessarily a part of the
not part of the pillar
framework, right?
That's part of the MobiCast.
Yeah. So the design principles, the focus areas, the key service, those are definitely all part of it. And then best practices are just examples of specific action items you can do in each one of those focus areas, right? In order to achieve the goals of that particular pillar. And so that's what we'll be talking as we go through each one of these pillars. We'll absolutely be calling out these design principles, the focus areas, the key service that the key AWS service that enables this pillar, and then we'll go through some examples of some best practices that you could do.
Right on. I guess though I'm still having a little trouble, and this is, now that I see this written like this, I'm sorry that our users can't see it written like this, but we're talking about this outline that has 2 things in it: design principles and focus areas, that to me feel real overlappy. And since design principles is kind of a technical thing that I understand from my education and from my experience, but focus areas is kind of not. It's more like a wishy-washy term in my mind. I don't really know how to store this, right, in my mind. And I don't know how to use it, because it's like, I got to be thinking about my design principles. No, I can't forget my focus areas. Like, there's too much, right? Have you figured out a way to kind of let this rest in your head?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the good news here, I mean, you don't have to, because at the end of the day, this is all going to come down to the well-architected review, and that's going to guide you through all this stuff. So you don't, so like design principles, I mean, these are not exhaustive either, right? In the well-architected framework, they call this out specifically just to kind of, again, I think to kind of show like what's important and what's changed now in the cloud native world versus the way things used to be.
Right.
And these are kind of things, the kind of action items that you can wrap your mind around that you'll be doing, but it's absolutely not exhaustive, right? We listed 6 design principles for operational excellence, and I mean, we could sit here and at a whiteboard and probably come up with 25 pretty easily. So,
I mean, just to kind of poke this in the eye a little bit more, though, I mean, really, this is sort of problematic for me, and I think it's because of just the way my brain works. I like things to be really specific and to work together with each other. And I read this focus areas, or I think about focus areas. And in my mind, when I think of a focus area, I think of, okay, well, there's a big thing of stuff, and I want to focus on an area of it. So maybe there's like ways of sending messages around. So my focus area is going to be on message buses, or like, let's take it out of computers. Like, there's poverty around the world. I'm going to have my focus area be racial inequality. That's my focus area. Or like, I'm a PhD student and I'm a student in biology, and my focus area is going to be on RNA. And these focus areas that I'm reading for operational excellence are prepare, operate, evolve. Do you see how that doesn't make sense?
Yeah, I mean, think of the focus areas as just segmentations right, of the things that you need to be doing and thinking about for the particular pillar, right? So it's just, they really are just like buckets, right? So it's like, how are we going to slice this up into categories or subcategories? And that's what these focus areas are, right? So for an operational excellence, you're either preparing, you're operating, or you're evolving, right? It's a very straightforward way to just like say, like, these are distinct phases of design development in relation to operational excellence.
When you just said phases, I was like, oh yeah, that would have been a good term for it. I think it's really, I'm just kind of angry at the terminology. And I think it probably came out of somebody trying to make it consistent across things that are not actually the same things. And that happens, right? Like if you take oranges and apples and you try to talk about, if you try to talk about them in the same exact way, things are just not going to work out, right? So in this case, operational excellence is a really different thing from security. So yeah, focus areas, like for operational excellence, like maybe it should have talked about phases, and for security, maybe focus areas made more sense. We're not there yet, but yeah, sorry. It really does make it hard for me when the terms don't match the things they refer to. It's hard for me to remember things. So take that, AWS.
Yeah. So, for the rest of this, just think of focus areas as just like segments of breaking up, like just what needs to be done underneath this pillar. And for each one of these, it's going to be a little bit different on how they've broken it up, but they're always going to be called focus areas.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So some services that are going to be important for this. So in prepare, things like AWS config and AWS config rules are things that you want to have top of mind. For operate, things like CloudWatch and CloudTrail, VPC flow logs, X-ray. These are all ways to get insight, telemetry, and
while the system is running.
Yeah. And then for Evolve, they talk about how Elasticsearch is pretty important here, and also things like CloudWatch Insights as well, right? So this is the how do you actually go and search your telemetry to gain insights and whatnot, so that you can make these changes based upon the data and then measure them, right? So just point out, like in the well-architected framework, they are listing like, hey, here's some of the AWS services that are particularly going to be useful for these particular focus areas in this particular pillar.
And the prepare, operate, and evolve kind of maps to deployment types of tools, operational types of tools, and analytical types of tools.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Interesting.
Yeah. So maybe we can give some best practices examples for some of these focus areas. So starting off with prepare. So one of the things, best practice definitely you want to do, right, is implement telemetry. Being able to generate that telemetry and then collect it, and so kind of defining what kind of metrics you want, right? So and this is for various different components of your workload. So you want telemetry for your application at an application level, you want it at a workload level, you want it at a user activity level, and then you also want it for your dependencies.
Right. And we've talked about this before, that telemetry is a fancy word for metrics, and that's what you use if you want to seem cool at software parties.
Yes. And so you'll know, this is pretty comprehensive, right? Like application, workload, user activity, dependencies. A lot of folks out there, like if they have telemetry just for at the application level, like they've got the checkbox marked, right? They're like done. And that's really like what I think probably by and large, most workloads out there are doing. So to really, this kind of goes back to like the pragmatic approach to this is like how much are you going to do of the well-architected framework, right? So it's absolutely best practice. You have to do it at all of these 4 different levels for collecting and analyzing telemetry, but like are you going to do it, right? Are you actually going to spend the time, the resources, the effort to go do all this?
Yeah, and it's just great to know this stuff so that you can make an informed trade-off decision instead of kind of an ignorant trade-off decision.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and that's definitely, again, like the thrust of the WellArchitected framework is to give you everything, right? I mean, this is comprehensive.
Yeah.
So again, it's like everything you need to go run like Gmail, right? Like this is it, right? Everything you need to run DynamoDB, like it is covered in this, right? Yeah. So, an example of another best practice in the prepare focus area would be implementing transaction traceability, right? Pretty important with microservices architecture, being able to thread a user initiated action all the way through the system as it touches various microservices, and having that traceability. So pretty complicated, pretty sophisticated, and not all, you may not be doing it, but again, as a best practice, like this is what we would all aspire to.
Right.
So operate, some examples of best practices there. They do talk a lot about runbooks and playbooks. An example of a best practice here would be like any event for which you raise an alert should have an associated runbook entry, right? And so your runbook defines, and it will define triggers for escalations for when this particular alert needs to be bumped up a level, like, and wake someone up, right, or whatnot. So a runbook it documents procedures that need to be performed, and so these are the things like make a backup of your database, right, or restore a backup of your database, or encrypt something and place it into a secure bucket or something like that. It could be how to do a rollback of a deployment, right? But so the distinction being a runbook is about if this happens, this is what you do, right? They're well defined events and how to deal with them, and then a playbook is for how do you basically troubleshoot and deal with issues that come up, right? So this might be something like you're getting latency in the system at some level. How would you go and, what do you do there? Or, right. And so I know we personally at Kelsus, we've talked about runbooks, and we have runbooks.
Yep.
We combine both of these aspects to it, right? And I think we could probably do better by actually splitting them up, and to really think of them as two separate things, as runbooks and playbooks, and think about like how do we automate more of the runbook, the actions that need to happen, right? Instead of having this be a manual thing. It also gives a bit more structure to it as well, just from a like what does this contain in it type thing. So, but again, as a best practice, like if you have an event that you're going to generate an alert for, well, you better have a runbook entry for it. Another best practice in the operate focus area is that if the system is impacted, then your user should be notified, right? They should have a way of knowing that. And so you'll notice like all the most of the big services out there do this, right? They have status pages. So, GitHub or AWS itself, or just about everyone, Salesforce, they all have a status page that you can go see, and, are there issues going on? They typically will have feeds, maybe like Twitter feeds or whatnot, letting people know what's going on. So just again, as a best practice, your users should be notified if there is something going on.
I think even the biggest systems out there don't really do that great a job of that. Like it's always like I think there's a problem here. Let's go check Twitter and see if everyone agrees, kind of thing. And then people, point to the status page and say things like, "Oh, it's not working for me, but the status page is not updated yet." Like that kind of stuff is, even at the biggest, most famously well-operated companies in the world, that's still it's like an aspirational best practice.
It is, and that is really frustrating too. When there's something wrong, and you go to the status page and you're like, "Nope, thumbs up, it's all green."
Right.
Come on, like what use is this? So it's not easy to get it right, but again, as a best practice, it's definitely something to aspire to.
Yeah.
And then some examples in the evolve focus area, feedback loops. So these help you identify areas for improvement They help you gauge the impact of changes to the system. Like, so, when you did have this idea and this change based upon the data that you're seeing and whatnot, like, you need to be able to measure it and really ascertain, like, did it actually improve, or is it not improving? Did it make things worse? Kind of doing things like having regular operational reviews, right? Where you go and you look at the metrics for a particular period and, use these reviews to identify opportunities for, like, how can we improve? Like, what are some of the potential courses of action? And just in general, just sharing lessons learned, right? So you can be talking about, like, what operational events you had during that period, what the overall health of the services, the workloads were, how many issues came up and were resolved, all sorts of things. So kind of getting into that diligence of saying, hey, operations is really key. It's important. We do want to have this constant learning and improvement. And so we're gonna treat it as a first-class citizen and have these regular reviews of our operations.
For the smallest team, I can imagine an operational review being kind of reduced down to, like, even just like a once a month check-in, kind of like hey, what part of running the system do we just hate right now? Like, what part is just bothering us? What part do we want to fix so that we don't have to do it manually or fix little broken threads everywhere every time this happens, kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, even just, an ad hoc thing like that is definitely a step in the right direction, and it's actually not too much work to put some data behind that too, right? So it could be something as simple as just measuring in the number of, bugs that get generated during the course of a, certain amount of time, or how many alerts were, generated during a specific time, or how many, if you do things like with your logging, emitting a, warning or error levels, like how many of those events happened. And those are all, pretty easy to plug into and get data on. And they're definitely good heuristics for knowing, just how well you're operating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So maybe just to wrap up with this pillar, then some, like, really just key points are run books, playbooks, make sure you have them. Document your environments. So multiple different environments usually for your workloads, dev, stage, prod, whatnot. Make your small changes through automation. Monitor your workload with business metrics. Practice your response to failures. Don't wait for them to happen. Have those game days, and have a well-defined escalation management. Right. So, be very clear about, like, when something needs to be addressed manually by a real person versus what can be done in code versus what can be looked at later. So understand, like, what things should be escalated and risen up. And again, if you're waking someone up, you better have
it's kind of be important. Yeah. And those are the kinds of things that you don't even really need a well-architected framework to figure out. That's the stuff that every company that operates software starts to figure out pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah. I mean, especially if you're the person getting woken up at 2:30 in the morning, right? So
exactly.
At some point, you got to cry uncle and say, "No, it's crazy."
Well, there is so much here, Chris. I mean, this is just huge. This well-architected framework, and I don't think we can do another pillar today.
I don't think so either. I think this is, again, and we're still just kind of like scratching the surface here. We could. I think, the point I want to stress is that there is just a wealth of information here. I mean, this is based upon, running these very big workloads in AWS and everything that goes into it. And so there's a lot of really good information here. Again, you're going to have to figure out, like, what's applicable to you and what you can implement versus what you can't. But it's a lot of really good information. So yeah, we got through one pillar. We got 4 left. I think this is probably going to end up being like a 3-parter.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, and thank you everyone for listening. We'll talk to you next week.
All right. We'll see you. Bye.
Nobody listens to podcast outros. Why are you still here? Oh, that's right. It's the outro song. Come talk to us at mobicast.fm or on Reddit at r/mobicast.